morning and welcome to our British Water Thought Leadership Series, Talking on Water. My name's Mark Fletcher and I'm the current chair of British Water. I have with me today Mark FREng, and he's the Chief Inspector of the Drinking Water Inspectorate, who's kindly agreed to an interview. We're recording it to share across the water sector, so good morning, Marcus.
Good morning, Mark, and are you well?
Yeah, very well, thanks. So in terms of an outline for the interview, I'm going to ask a few questions and Marcus can share his thoughts. And we can have some follow-up for clarification. We'll see how we go. I hope you're all relaxed. We can make a start. So first of all, Marcus, what's your vision for the Drinking Water Inspectorate, given this increasing focus on water quality?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really positive thing that there is focus on drinking water. I mean, drinking water, as far as I'm concerned, is one of the most important things within our society. But I think what I'd probably do is put some context on the provision of water, how good the industry is, and perhaps some of the challenges. So I think we're very fortunate in this country that we have very good, high quality drinking water. And in my view, that when we compare that to the wider world, that certainly is a benefit. We know, for instance, that we have about 99.97% compliance. Roughly, that's about 1,000 failures from 4 million compliance points. So the standard is very high, but also if you compare that, for instance, with the rest of the world, and there was a recent study done by Yale, which was published in 2022, which looked at the Environmental Performance Index and measures the number of people or days lost due to disease with the link to environmental factors such as water and sanitation health. And the UK comes up as one of the top 6 countries in the world. And that really validates the quality of water here. So I'm not just turning around and saying, well, you know, we have 99.96 or 99.97% compliance, and so we're great. We have an international measure that shows that the water quality and our water and sanitation health in this country is particularly good. And in that respect, that kind of makes my job somewhat easier, or you would think. But my view is that you shouldn't be complacent, because at the end of the day, if you become complacent and you stand still, then what happens is that you end up going backwards, don't you? And you fall into that place where you think everything is okay. So we have some challenges, I would say, ahead of us. We can see that there is the impact of climate change, which is having an impact upon our water and our water resource, and that ultimately has an impact upon our drinking water, or potential impact. We have potential contaminants, which we are starting to understand a little bit more about them. We have issues around some legacy in our networks, and that, for instance, needs to be resolved. Some of the things we haven't resolved over a number of years, and we need to think about that. And we also need to think about the resilience of our water supply, because we have other challenges, not just with resource, but also, for instance, with energy and power and aging networks, which mean that we need to be really mindful of how we go about that. So if I was summing all of that up and I was thinking, well, you know, what's my vision? Well, my vision is to make sure that we stay with 99.97% compliance and higher, and that we stay with 100 on the Environmental Performance Index internationally, that we stay where we have good quality, wholesome and sufficient water for everybody within the country, and that we have access to that good quality drinking water for 99+% of our population. But I also see that we need to maintain our focus on drinking water. We shouldn't just forget about it. We shouldn't just turn around and say, well, you know, it's okay, we don't need to do anything. And we then need to focus clearly on those challenges to keep us at the top and to make sure that we're delivering for the public. And that really probably encompasses it.
Yeah, I wonder if the public are really aware, or they just take for granted the quality that we achieve in the performance. I wonder, what do you think what's your view of the supply chain's role in sort of helping to maintain these standards and solve some of these future challenges?
Yeah, I mean, the supply chain is a hugely important element of the provision of water. Everybody who is involved in drinking water has a responsibility to achieve the delivery of that water in a good, clean, wholesome, sufficient way, and that includes the supply chain. I think people, and we all forget about the supply chain, and they're almost invisible to the public. So the perception of the public, as I see it, when you look at drinking water, the whole drinking water industry is almost invisible to the public, because they go in to their kitchen, they turn the tap on, the water is good, clean all the time, and therefore there's no reason why you would question it till the day that it doesn't work. But when you think about the supply chain, well, what does the supply chain do? Well, it provides maintenance to all the assets, operates them, builds, collects data, provides information, underpins consultancy. So you can say it goes all the way, right from the raw materials all the way to provision of drinking water. And what I would say to the supply industry is that they're vital. They're absolutely vital. Without the supply industry, we wouldn't have disinfection, we wouldn't have coagulation, we wouldn't even have the treatment works that were there, or the maintenance, or the equipment, or all these things that purify the water, or even the data out in the network. So, but I would also say to the supply industry that they have a responsibility, that what they do means that as soon as they operate or insert themselves within the supply industry, they have that responsibility, the same as anyone else, to provide that good quality water, whether it's the person who's digging the road and tapping the main into a household, or the architect who's drawing or creating a drinking water treatment works, or any treatment works, even if it's water or wastewater. So hugely important and a vital part of provision of drinking water.
Yeah, I think very much we talked about the supply chain and the companies and the regulators working together with a much more common purpose to improve public health for people in this country. I think it's really important.
Yeah, I was just going to respond to that, because I was going to say that some of the things that the supply industry does has a direct impact on that public health. So, for instance, if we talked about the materials that the supply industry produces, those materials have to make and be of the highest quality, so that there is no impact upon that drinking water, and therefore when they're applying, let's say, a paint or a pipe or a fitting, they've got to think about what that means for drinking water and what's the impact of that. Sorry, you were going to go and ask another question there, and I kind of went off on a tangent thinking about all that.
Well, I like that, because I think that is really important, and it is that attention to detail that's absolutely important when public health's concerned. And and I've had a sense of working over many years, seeing how much better everybody's working together in a more integrated way, which is it's really quite good to see. I wonder, maybe what do you see maybe some of the opportunities to collaborate to safeguard our environment, maybe help deliver much more of a social contract for the communities we serve?
Yeah, I think it's really important that you focus on the social contract. I would almost say that the delivery of water is the origin of a social contract, isn't it, with the public? Because you know, water is life. And without water, there is no life. In fact, I've shamelessly taken that from UNICEF, who use that as a strapline to say water is life, and life is water. Without water, there is no life. And we can track that all the way back, I think, to certainly when we're thinking about the UK, we can track that back to the 19th century, the mid 19th century, where clearly drinking water, or the absence of drinking water, and the absence of sewage provision was did not provide a service to the public, and ultimately there was significant disease within the public. So here I'm kind of thinking about cholera and typhoid and dysentery and all the unpleasant diseases that were experienced between 1850 and the beginning of the 1900s. And it was clear to Parliament at the time that there needed to be a social service to take that sewage away, and we saw the super sewer, the original super sewer, being built ultimately, and the provision of good quality drinking water and disinfection actually being introduced just at the end of the 1800s and at the beginning of the 1900s. So that provision of water is a societal service, and the taking away of wastewater is a societal service, and it precedes actually gas or electricity or latterly telecommunications. And we must remember that is the first, almost the seminal social contract. Now, water companies ultimately continue to provide that social contract. And we have to work in partnership between ourselves, the water companies, and the suppliers to ensure that that social contract and the root meaning of that social contract is maintained.
I agree, and indeed, when those services were first provided, it made such a dramatic difference to people's lives that the engineers at the time, they were highest level of society. They were sort of exalted for this transformation that they delivered. And I think because some subsequent generations haven't experienced that transformation, there is a sense of some of those services being taken for granted by the public.
I really do think so. That people do take the service for granted, and I talked about people going to the kitchen tap and turning on the tap and expecting water. I mean, we don't have to cast our minds back too far to see circumstances where that didn't happen. I was talking about 1850s and disease, and then latterly in the 1800s with the Great Stink, which had major debates within Parliament to sort out the societal service. But we've only got to cast our minds back something like less than 50 years actually, to 1976, when we had periods of drought, which resulted in people queuing up at standpipes because there was water rationing. Now, we can never get back to that point, or we should never get back to that point. So it behooves us to really think about how we work as a regulator to make sure, or to encourage companies to provide a sufficient resilient service, and the supply industry to consider the water industry as one of their highest priorities, particularly when we're thinking about supply chain risk.
Absolutely. That's quite a useful segue, because I wanted to just talk about in a sort of changing climate, what do you think the main risks are to water quality and public health from your perspective? Because we're seeing almost in the news more extreme and more frequent extremes, and what's the impact from your perspective?
Yeah, I don't think we have to look too far back to see the impacts of things like climate change, changing meteorological conditions in response to climate change. And in 2022, we had probably one of the most challenging years since 1976, whereby a number of the reservoirs were at such low levels that there was a real concern that we were going to run out of water. I think the best example there is Colliford Reservoir in Southwest Water, which dropped to 14% and drove the company, Southwest Water or Southwest Bournemouth Water, to consider what measures they needed to do. And they put into that the Stop the Drop campaign, where they decided that if they achieved 30% of the reservoir, they would go and refund or pay consumers £30. I thought that was a great initiative by the company, and it just showed, though, the level of concern that was associated with that. But you might think that is solely about raw water resource, but the impact, of course, if water ran out, would be direct on consumers. We would find that there would be some real public uproar, if you like, over no water. But there were more subtle things, because the industry did a fantastic thing, really. They managed to continue to supply despite all the odds in 2022, despite the fact that the consumption of water in some places went up by 30% by the public. You could almost measure it. I think I saw one statistic which said as soon as the temperature reaches about 26 or 27, you can almost correlate that with the rise in water consumption as people start to fill their in-garden pools and water their gardens and so on. And such is the supply-demand balance in that it's so fragile. But if we think about it, when we look at what's happened over 2022, so we saw a small number, but nevertheless significant number, where the reduction in reservoir levels resulted in an increase in algal growth. So the combination of heat and concentration of water resulted in algal growth, and that resulted in byproducts of algal metabolism. So here I'm thinking about geosmin and MIB, which are taste causing compounds. People can really taste this in their water. It's quite an earthy taste, and many people find that quite unpleasant. So we saw that in a couple of instances, but more concerningly, we saw circumstances where the impact on the raw water exceeded the capability of the water treatment work. So here we had an example in one instance where the concentration in the raw water resource increased manganese levels, and that water with a higher level of manganese went through the works, and in combination with the increase in consumer usage, was going through the works too fast, and manganese couldn't be removed. So there were two effects there. One was an accelerated seeding of the network of manganese, and the second one was the then disturbance of that manganese in the network, which was causing discoloured water. So here we saw direct visual effects on drinking water as a result of a concentration of a raw water resource. Now that it isn't just metals and algae, but we see this also with biologicals or microbiologicals. So, for instance, we had examples where we were starting to see cryptosporidium concentrating in the raw water resource, because many of the works have a dependency on the level of raw water cryptosporidium, in that they can remove it by 2-3 logs and so on. But if you're increasing that raw level of cryptosporidium, you're then challenging that treatment works beyond its capability. So there were instances where we were starting to see small numbers of cryptosporidiosis working its way through the works. Now, those small numbers had no impact on consumer health, but they really are starting to flag when the works is starting to struggle. So I've given a couple of examples where the water is reduced in respect of the raw water resource, but actually we can see it the other way round. So, for instance, when we have meteorological changes due to climate change, and here I'm kind of thinking about increase in rain. So what we're seeing is some real heavy rainfall. Now, we've seen it in Italy and Spain. It's not quite the same as where we see the monsoon in India, but to see these situations where we're seeing floodwaters going through in Spain and Italy, it's quite dramatic to see these changes. But here we don't have, or we haven't had such dramatic, well, we have had some, but in 2022, for instance, we've had heavy rain that's landed on soil, which has been very dry, and that creates a quick transition of the water over the top of that soil. So in one instance, we saw the humic substances being picked up off that topsoil, rushing through to the treatment works, and we depend a lot on, for instance, UV now as our means of disinfection. But UV is only effective if it can see through the water, if you like. It has transmissibility, so it can see through. The water's nice and clear. Now, if you add humic substances, that colours the water, and suddenly you reduce the effectiveness of the UV light. And in this instance, what we were seeing is the UV light dropping below the validated limit of that UV water. So that was threatening disinfection. And that's from new technology such as UV, because I could give you examples of where, for instance, heavy rain has increased the turbidity in lakes, and that turbidity has then impacted the drinking water, so the coagulation isn't as efficient, or it just can't remove the turbidity, and that hits the filters, and so you then get that turbidity coming through. And so the consequence there is the suboptimal efficiency and removal of that treatment works, threatening our water supply. But these are all things that have happened due to climatic conditions and meteorological conditions impacting works. But there's something a little bit more, what I would call difficult in terms of resource and how companies are having to manage. So, for instance, we had a rather unusual event last year, for instance, where the company found that their raw water resource was lower than normal, so they had to resort to another borehole. And actually, in this instance, what we saw is that the draw from this other borehole was under an airport or an airfield, in fact. And we know there are environmental risks with respect to some of the airfields or airports or airfields, and here I'm thinking about some of these emerging contaminants. So what we started to see is the company felt that they had to draw from one particular borehole to make up their resource deficit. What they were drawing on was a borehole that had underlying contamination of PFOS. And actually that then started to raise beyond what we would consider an appropriate limit for wholesome water. So that's not so much weather related, but it's climate related in the resource and the struggles that some companies are having in some of the areas within England. And I'll give you one last example, and we can go back to some of those examples more and discuss them. But so, for instance, we had a situation where, again, it's about boreholes, and we start to see over abstraction on boreholes. And if we're thinking about boreholes that may be on islands or close to coastal areas, then we start to see that over abstraction having saline intrusion, dragging water from the coastline, and it no longer being that fresh water. And ultimately, what we then see is a rise in chlorate, and that then means that that has a contraindication for small children. And in fact, we looked at one of the islands. We identified that there was saline intrusion, and we had to serve a notice on the company to say, well, look, the rising chlorate needs the company to start warning the consumers that there's a change in water quality, which for the majority of people has no impact, but for a small population. So we're having to think about these, and all these examples happened in 2022. So the reason why I say I don't have to look back, I don't have to look back to 1853 or 1885 and cholera. I just need to look back to 2022. And the impact that we're starting to see on climate change. So, when we're thinking about what we're doing, as a regulator, we're starting to talk to companies, and we're starting to say, look, we can start to see, here are examples. And in fact, I wrote a lot about this in my report, where I was saying, here are real examples of climate change impacting meteorological conditions, impacting water supply. I don't need to make them up. I can physically show you. So we need to think about a couple of things. We need to think about how we understand those changes. So this might be about risk assessment. It might be about monitoring. So we have the risk assessment in the predictive model, and the monitoring in the reactive model, if you like. And that would be monitoring either at from source to tap. So we might see it in boreholes or water treatment works or in networks, but also understanding. If we abstract from a borehole, what does that mean? Will that mean saline intrusion? Will that mean a contamination of PFOS or PFAS in more generally? What's the impact upon our rivers? And what's the concentration of those rivers? And if we start to think about what the upstream risks are, that we start to think about what's the impact on our waste treatment works, and how does those waste treatment works work, and what are the challenges that they are starting to think about. So here I'm kind of thinking about changes in public behaviour and recreational use of things. So we might see recreational use of drugs, where we've carried out research. So my focus is really understanding what those risks are in that natural waterway, and what that means for treatment work. So, for instance, you might see things like endocrine disruptors, because they're coming through concentration from water treatment works, increase in analgesics, because people are using more things such as aspirin or Panadol or paracetamol, I should say, or things like that. Increase in antidepressants. Increase in, as I say, in recreational drug use, and what does that mean for our waterway, and what then does that mean with respect to our drinking water? And we carry out a lot of research here to understand what that means and whether the water treatment is sufficient to deal with that. So, for instance, the majority of potential contaminants at this stage don't pose a threat, probably with the exception of PFAS, where we have to look at that closely because of the persistence. And as we go through a reduction in raw water resource, then these are more meaningful. So the conversation that I'll have with water companies is what does that mean? So the two best examples here of what does that mean is around PFAS and a great parallel example of microplastics. Both of them were in the public eye. There was a big public interest, and you started off what was by asking, what's the challenges in drinking water? So these challenges come along every now and again, and people say, microplastics, what does that mean for me? And for us, as the regulator, we're starting to try and think, what are those risks? So what's the horizon scanning? So most of the day, you know, I'm sort of, or I'm watching some sport on TV, you know, as I like to do, and I'm kind of thinking, what are those horizon risks, and what do we need to be doing, and how do we approach that risk? Because often the industry, the water industry and the supplier industry look towards DWI to get that understanding of what those future risks are. Now, I would say that DWI is not the font of all knowledge. You know, we have a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge within DWI, but we're not the font of all knowledge, and we have to ask people, you know, people who really do understand some of the real meaning of those challenges. So when I was sitting down thinking, now we've got a problem called microplastics, and it's entering into our waterways, and we're abstracting from that. One, where's it coming from? So, you know, the question is, where's it coming from? You know, does it come through our wastewater? Does it come through the wastewater treatment plants? Is that the main contributor, or indeed is it in fact the runoff from roadways because of car tires, for instance? So we let some research to UCWER and actually Cranfield University, and we said, look, what we need to do is we need to understand what that risk produces and what that means. So, you know, we're very grateful for researchers in this space, because both UCWER and Cranfield looked at this problem and came back and said, well, you know, wastewater treatment is highly efficient at removing particles. It's almost a question you could have answered yourself, isn't it? But you had to do the experimentation to look at it. And then Cranfield started to look at, you know, microplastic spheres and fibres, and when they started to look at the relative efficiencies between coagulation and filtration, they said, well, coagulation isn't quite as efficient with fibres as it is with spheres of microplastics. But when it gets to the filtration, so let's say 50% of fibres is removed by coagulation, which I think is about the right thing. When it goes on to the filtration, because it's all about particle removal, we have removal of 99.9999% of microplastics, and that includes fibres and all shapes. So we had really strong evidence to indicate that particle removal by water treatment works is effective in microplastics. So when we're thinking about the strategy, or when I'm thinking about what's the strategy of DWI, how do we deal, what's our reaction to this research? Because it's about educating ourselves and informing ourselves and then making that decision. So we educated ourselves, and our decision about microplastics was that actually microplastics are, whilst they're prevalent in the environment and they're prevalent in our waterways due to our society, because most of the things that cause problems to drinking water is what we do in our society. And the evidence indicated that actually we didn't see that as something we needed to take further action on, other than the research to back that up. And actually, we don't just look at one piece of research, we look at many pieces. So we looked at, as I said, Cranfield, we looked at UCWER, and we looked at WHO, and we compared all these pieces of research, and they were all saying the same thing. So we thought, right, that risk isn't so high, we don't need as much action from companies. But now, when we look at something like PFAS, okay, so we're approaching the problem in the same way. We're starting to say, what does this mean for us? Now, obviously, there's been a lot of publicity in the United States, and we know that this is a fantastic substance which, you know, is highly resistant. The substitution of hydrogen with fluorine is a really, really useful substance. I think, was it produced by DuPont in the 50s? I think is if my memory serves me right, but you know, don't quote me if I'm wrong. But the persistence of this meant, and the fact that it's used in everything, and I really bring attention to the fact that it's used in everything, because people focus down on drinking water. And so if we're coming back to your original question is, you know, why is there an increasing focus? Because suddenly people have this perception of risk. they start to say, well, that drinking water perceived high risk. But the reality is that PFAS is everywhere. It's on, it's on our carpets, it's in our food packaging, it's in the utensils we cook with, it's in makeup. I mean, there isn't, and we quite happily use makeup on ourselves with PFAS in it, flame retardants, in our cars, everywhere, on our sofas, wherever we sit. So we are immersed in PFAS everywhere. Now, when we dump this stuff and it leaches into our groundwater, it lasts largely forever. So we started to look at this, and actually, we knew that PFAS in one particular instance, one particular species, PFOS and PFOA, are two substances that we were aware of, and we were aware of this from Buncefield in the mid-noughties. Where we had seen contamination, so we had started to ask for research on what that meant, and there was a complete deficit of information on these substances at the time. But I think as the thinking becomes a little more clarified about the risks of those, we saw. I kind of sat down and I thought, well, where do we go with this, and what is it that we do? So, the first thing we needed to do is actually be able to understand what the problem is. So I'm coming back to this really simple strategy. What is the problem? And actually, we didn't have a lot of information. There was virtually no base information about how much PFAS was prevalent in the environment. And the only way we could gather that information was to turn around to water companies and say to water companies, well, look, why would you go away and measure what PFAS is, and then we had to think about what were we asking for. So were we asking for PFAS or PFO, or were we asking for other substances? So we had a discussion with the Environment Agency to decide what were the appropriate substances, and this is we came up with a list that was largely combined with what could we measure, what was being imported in large quantities in the country, so under REACH and so on, and what was the potential perceived risk. So you'll know we came up with these 47 substances, which we said, well, look, out of the 10,000, we had to understand what they were. Now, there's kind of logic in that, because, for instance, Europe has gone for 20, but we wanted a slightly wider picture of understanding what it meant when you compared it with the substances that were being brought into the country, because we didn't really understand, and we still don't understand, which one poses the most risk overall. The toxicology really isn't there. So the water company went away, and obviously this was a really big ask of the water industry, and they did an absolute fantastic job. Within months, they were starting to be able to analyse for this. We let research actually with Birmingham University to understand how we effectively and accurately measure these PFAS, because up until then no one had really measured them. There wasn't the sensitivity, and the specificity really wasn't there. So all the data before 2020 was largely inadequate or invalid. So you'll hear lots of quotes about what the levels were before those times, but actually we don't know what they were, because the validity of the analysis wasn't as robust. So we let this research, we shared it with the industry. The industry have developed the extra methodology, and again, here we're talking about supply industry and laboratories, aren't we? Because we're talking about the provision of high-tech equipment which had to be purpose-built and purpose-made to analyse novel substances, which we had never done before. The service industry, in terms of the laboratory, had to step up to the mark to deal with this, and we had to ask, quite a lot of, all the support from the water industry to do this. And we published in 2022, ultimately, the what we found after something like 320 or 350,000 analysis of PFAS compounds or substances, and suddenly we were in a position that we knew what the issue was. We knew now where the risks were, where they're not, and we had physical data to show this. And actually, we asked companies to prioritise the highest risks abstractions. So, try to go and find it. And out of that, we found that 3.8% of those had some detection of a PFAS. Now, that's a highly biased data set because it's samples and resamples at places where we were expecting to find it. And we found about 3/4 of PFAS of those 47. So we now know that there are, a wide variety of PFAS out in the environment throughout widespread areas. But we also learned where the hotspots were, and we also learned that actually when you tested the raw water and then you tested the final water, we found no PFAS over 100 nanograms anywhere in our drinking water. And that really put us into that place that we were really confident, actually, that the water industry had stepped up to the mark and had produced that high quality water which people can be confident in. And what's more is we then turned around to the industry and we started to say, well, now we know what the problem is. We've had research how to measure it. We've now developed what that picture is of what we're thinking of. We're now saying to the industry, now, how do we solve it? Because there's an expectation that, we continue to move forward. So one of the very opening things when I was saying is that we need to continue moving forward. So we're going to continue moving forward. And how do we put the solutions out there? So we've started to turn around to companies and we started to say, well, okay, we're great because you don't have any more, we have no water over 100 nanograms. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to challenge the water companies and we're going to say, well, what are your detections between 10 and 100? Okay, because we're getting into that risk space. We're starting to say, what does that risk? We don't really know what the risk is. There's no toxicology. So there's no point turning around and saying, oh, you need to have a standard of 2 nanograms, okay, because rainwater will fail. Okay, and you have to treat every water everywhere.
There's a pragmatism to it, yes.
So what we need to understand is, what do the companies need to do to plan if we're looking at 10 to 100, and how would they deal with that? So what we did is we let some research to say, what are the technologies that need to be used to deal with the challenges that we're starting to see? How do companies put this in the business plan? And because we're talking about the supply industry here, and this is, and I keep coming back to supply industry and how important the supply industry is. And I was interested because we had a drinking water conference just recently, last week or the week before, and it was really great to see the supply industry in the conference promoting their products, and these included products which were potentially able to deal with some of these issues. So, for instance, we see things like ion exchange and carbon, and so what we're doing is we're getting into this innovative space because we've now described what that problem is. We're now relatively sure and are starting to crystallize how we deal with it. And now the service industry and the supply industry is starting to step up into that innovation space.
I think that whole, what you just described there is this, how do we sort of practically apply innovation and research to real problems? I'm very impressed with the depth of domain knowledge, because you can put something like, taken climate change, you related it to things that people can look and see, but maybe at different parts of the water cycle, and see how they come together. It's fantastic. Our members are going to be, I think that they're going to be very impressed that, and I feel very reassured that our drinking water inspectorate has such a depth and breadth and connects things. I am encouraged that you've acknowledged the role that the companies play, often an unsung role that isn't reflected in the negative press that we see. And I really do get a sense that we're all working together to a sort of a collective end, a true collaboration across the supply chain, the companies and the regulators. But with challenges or emerging challenges like PFAS, PFOS, PFO, gosh, FIFO fun. It is reassuring, not just the approach you've described, but the depth and breadth of what we've been doing. I just wonder, is there anything else, in conclusion, is there anything else you'd like to share with our members that you think, maybe about the sector as a whole? You represent some really dedicated people at the Inspectorate, clear. And it's quite small but perfectly formed, because I think everyone seems to be very practical and pragmatic. Anything else you'd like to share with our members if we draw this together to a conclusion?
Yeah, I think it's hugely important to be clear that we do need to take a collaborative approach. We need to be clear that we have to be pragmatic and ensure that there's space for innovation and efficiencies. We do have to be clear that we have to increase our communication, and we do realise that there has to be a central means by which this is facilitated. So, I mean, you represent British Water. And I mean, it's a fantastic organisation for the supply industry, and it is the real focal point. And I know that British Water is becoming much more prominent in what you're doing and where you are, both in social media, but also physically as well in representation. And when I look at the social media, because I actually do look at the social media, and I see a lot of the posts by members, your members, talking about some of the innovative space that they're in. It never ceases to amaze me, the collective thinking, because I'm not one person who's coming up and solving all the problems. I was very clear about that. I actually need help. I realise there's an awful lot I don't know, and I don't know an awful lot about what it is I don't know. So I'm super dependent on your members actually filling that gap and understanding my limitations as a regulator. Now, I've given you some examples about those limitations in acquisition of knowledge, such as microplastics, innovation, such as ion exchange and carbon and so on with PFAS. But there are a lot more what I would call basic stuff that we kind of forget about. And these are things like network of replacements, pipe replacements, whether that's, iron, old iron, which is causing discoloration, but also lead. I can't forget to mention something like lead, and some of the innovation that we start to see around there, such as pipe splitting, replacement, lining, and so on, which is working towards a higher quality water and reducing those risks. And I don't think without your members and without British Water being in that space, allowing that innovation, it would work. Now, I realise that sometimes your members will look at regulators, and they will see regulators as sometimes a little bit inflexible. And we do work in some of the space of regulations which creates some of that inflexibility. That doesn't mean we won't listen and we won't try to work out what the pathway to that solution is and how we would go about getting that pathway to a solution. So I think the more dialogue that we have with your members through British Water, and the more understanding of some of the solutions that you're trying to bring forward and what it is that we need to do to try and facilitate that, I think the better. Otherwise, we're never going to solve PFAS, PFOA, microplastics, leads, iron mains, replacements, resource, assets, capability, storage, distribution, power, security, alternative. Listen, Mark, I could talk all day on all of these aspects in minute detail.
Well, I think we see it as we get greater alignment and collaboration across the companies and the regulators and the supply chain and the stakeholders, we see it a bit like strands starting to string and string form into Rome. If we're all pulling in the same direction, and I think we're ultimately interested in improving public health and improving our environment, that we a real common purpose around that, then we've all got a role to play. And I think the more that we can, the more that you can share, as you have done, really clearly articulated practical examples of how we're going about tackling really complex and complicated problems in a way in which we can do that in a pragmatic way, that where people see what their role is, then the better. I think it really is. We're going in the right direction. But I would like to thank you, because not just for your willingness to take part, but I really have a lot of respect for people who have real command of their domain, and that's come across in examples and the way in which you're talking. I could listen to you for hours. It's fascinating, and it is reassuring that our public health has people like you right at the heart of leading our approach. It's really reassuring. I want to wish you every success in your role as our Chief Inspector, and I know you're both active in this country and you share your experience elsewhere around. That's really important. And I would like to thank you on behalf of British Water. Really appreciate you taking the time, and this will be absolutely fascinating for our members. So thank you very much. That concludes our session, and that's a wrap. Okay.
That was an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much, Mark.